Thrash metal, perhaps the most aggressive member of the heavy metal family tree, began in the early 80s and paved the way for the more extreme metal subgenres we know today. Taking influence from the new wave of British heavy metal and hardcore punk, thrash was a reaction to the rising popularity of glam metal, which was seen by metal's hardcore fanbase as a polished, commercial, and corporate take on the genre. Thrash became a revolutionary movement within heavy metal circles and was led by the so-called Big Four: Anthrax, Megadeth, Slayer, and Metallica. Soon, it expanded throughout the United States and other territories such as Europe and South America, becoming the next significant step in the evolution of heavy metal. But who can be considered the inventor of thrash metal? Stay tuned as we explore the roots of this influential subgenre, from its early beginnings in the US to its dominance over the entire heavy metal realm. Influences from heavy metal and hardcore punk. Thrash metal arose from the underground to eventually become the most influential heavy metal subgenre of the 80s. But it didn't start completely out of nowhere. In the early 70s, there were a couple of songs that featured elements which would become staples of thrash later on. Queen's Stone Cold Crazy from 1974 was noted for its fast tempo and heavy riffing, which influenced speed metal. Another one was Black Sabbath's Symptom of the Universe from their 1975 album Sabotage. Although it wasn't as fast as Stone Cold Crazy, its heavy palm-muted main riff would later become a signature characteristic of thrash. As metal evolved in the 70s, more bands would put their own spin on the genre. Later bands in particular put an emphasis on speed, resulting in heavy metal songs played at the tempo of punk rock songs. British bands like Motorhead, Iron Maiden, Diamond Head, and Saxon exemplified this style best, and the resulting movement became known as the new wave of British heavy metal. Aside from these new British bands, thrash also took a lot of influence from hardcore punk, particularly its attitude and aggression. Hardcore bands such as Black Flag, Minor Threat, and Bad Brains played a faster and angrier brand of punk, features that were adopted by the thrash bands later on. With the influences now set in place, up-and-coming bands were ready to draw from them to create a new subgenre, and eventually a movement. The birth of thrash. The roots of thrash can be traced back to California, where many of the subgenre's early bands began. The earliest documented thrash band is Exodus, which formed in 1979 in Richmond, California. The band was started by high school students Tom Hunting, Keith Stewart, Tim McNello, and Kirk Hammett. In their early days, the group played covers of new wave of British heavy metal songs, but also took time to compose their own music. Eventually, the band brought in guitarist Gary Holt, who was formerly the band's roadie and vocalist Paul Bailoff. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles in 1981, another thrash group was starting to take place when drummer Lars Ulrich and guitarist and singer James Hetfield started to form their own band, Metallica. Its lineup in the early days consisted of Lars, James, bassist Ron McGovney, and lead guitarist Dave Mustaine. When Cliff Burton replaced McGovney on bass, the band relocated from Los Angeles to San Francisco's Bay Area, where other thrash metal bands were starting to form. Metallica quickly made a name for themselves in the underground thanks to their aggressive, lightning-fast brand of heavy metal. By 1983, they were ready to record their debut album and flew to Mexico to get it done. However, Mustaine's frequent bouts of violent behavior caused by his drinking and drug problems forced the band to kick him out before they began recording sessions. And who did they get to replace Mustaine? Exodus co-founder Kirk Hammett. Metallica released their debut album, Kill 'Em All, in 1983 to rave reviews. Noted for combining the speed and raw energy of punk with the musical complexity of metal, the album sounded unlike any other at the time. Some critics recognized the album as the official birth of thrash metal. Meanwhile, Exodus faced numerous personnel changes following Hammett's departure before they were able to stabilize their lineup. It took them 2 years after the release of Kill 'Em All before they unveiled their debut album, Bonded by Blood. The album is regarded as another essential thrash record, although many have wondered if the album and Exodus would have established a more significant legacy had they released it earlier. The Big Four. As for the exiled Dave Mustaine, he regrouped and formed his own thrash metal band Megadeth. Mustaine planned to be faster and heavier than his ex-bandmates in Metallica and delivered the goods in 1985 with Megadeth's debut album, Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. During Megadeth's formative years, One of the guitarists Mustaine tried to hire was Kerry King, known for being one of the founders of another legendary thrash band, Slayer. Formed in Huntington Park, California, Slayer became controversial for its use of violent, satanic imagery and its lyrics that covered subjects such as war, death, hell, and religion. It can be argued that Slayer's imagery and lyrical topics influenced the style of later death metal bands. While California kept producing new bands left and right, another thrash metal scene was brewing on the East Coast, led by groups such as New Jersey's Overkill and New York City's Nuclear Assault and Anthrax. The latter became the most prominent group to emerge from the East Coast thrash scene and released their debut album, Fistful of Metal, in 1984. The album included the track Metal Thrashing Mad, a song described by journalist Malcolm Dome upon its release as thrash metal. It was the first time the term was used in the music press, and it was soon used to describe the music of the young metalheads who played heavy, fast, and rough. Around this time, fans and critics referred to Anthrax, Slayer, Megadeth, and Metallica as the Big Four of thrash metal, as they were the four most influential and prominent bands to emerge from the Revolution. These four led the movement and produced some of the most revered recordings in heavy metal's history, including Among the Living by Anthrax, Peace Sells Who's Buying by Megadeth, Rain and Blood by Slayer, and Master of Puppets by Metallica. The latter is hailed not just as a classic of thrash, but as a timeless heavy metal relic and perhaps the genre's best album. Today, Master of Puppets is the only heavy metal album to be preserved by the U.S. Library of Congress in the National Recording Registry. The album, along with Peace Sells and Rain and Blood, was released in 1986, which is recognized as a pivotal year in establishing thrash as the next big thing in heavy metal. With the four leading the way, more thrash bands all over the country emerged, such as Testament, Death Angel, Forbidden, and Dark Angel. Even legendary hardcore punk band Suicidal Tendencies took influence from the scene and briefly shifted from being a punk band to a straight-out thrash metal outfit. But the thrash movement wasn't just spreading across the United States. It also reached other places such as Germany, where bands like Creator, Sodom, Destruction, and Tankard made their mark on the subgenre, eventually becoming known as the Big Four of Teutonic thrash metal. In Canada, bands like Annihilator and Voivod established a throng thrash scene. And over in Brazil, Sepultura emerged as one of South America's biggest musical exports, forging a brand of thrash that got them widespread recognition in the United States. Peak years and transition to groove metal. Thrash dominated the entire heavy metal scene in the 80s and created new subgenres such as death metal and black metal. Bands such as Possessed, Death, Morbid Angel, and Obituary took influences from thrash and brought it to new extremes in terms of music and imagery, while bands from the early Norwegian black metal scene created a darker, more menacing brand of metal that was influenced by thrash and death metal. Thrash continued to thrive in the late 80s up to the early 90s with albums such as Megadeth's Rust in Peace, Slayer's Seasons in the Abyss, Anthrax's Persistence of Time, Death Angel's Act 3, Sepultura's Beneath the Remains, and Testament's Souls of Black. However, the early 90s also saw many thrash bands stray from their original sound as part of their musical evolution. The most notable is Metallica, who took on a more streamlined and commercial sound in 1991 on their self-titled album known as the Black Album. Megadeth also adapted a more melodic and straightforward sound on their 1992 album Countdown to Extinction. By 1992, many prominent thrash bands of the 80s had either disbanded or changed their style. Mostly, these changes were a response to the shifting musical landscape thanks to the rise of alternative rock and grunge. At the end of thrash's metal peak, a new genre emerged from its ashes, led mainly by Texas-based band Pantera. Drawing from elements of thrash, hardcore, and traditional heavy metal, the style they pioneered became known as groove metal. The style became influential in its own right and was even adapted by some figures from the 80s thrash movement, such as Sepultura on their 1993 Chaos AD. Rob Finn, formerly of thrash outfit Violence, formed his own group Machine Head in the 90s and employed a groove metal style as well. Thrash metal may never be as big as it was in the 80s, but its impact on the heavy metal world is undisputed, and whoever said thrash is dead isn't paying enough attention. Today, the subgenre is enjoying a resurgence, not only due to the old bands like Exodus and Metallica returning to their roots, but also thanks to a new wave of bands like Havoc, Evil, Bonded by Blood, and Warbringer recalling the glory days of thrash through their records.